Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, the offensive of the United States against Venezuela. Our guest, Sam Husseini, senior analyst with the Institute for Public Accuracy. Sam Husseini, a warm welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be with you.
Sam, you have lived a very peculiar situation in recent days at the State Department with the unexpected appearance in a press briefing of Elliott Abrams. Please tell us from the beginning everything.
So I decided to go over to the State Department. You get notice if you go to their briefings, and they didn't say that Elliott Abrams would be there in the notice. But I decided to go over there because I wanted to ask a question about Venezuela. The former specialist, the rapporteur from the UN, had a piece that day in the British Independent, and he's gotten virtually no media in the United States, where he outlines a series of criticisms of US policy. So I wanted to at least get the deputy spokesperson that was on the schedule to speak to comment on that. So I'm sitting there in the briefing room, and the security was a little tougher on me than usual. I didn't know why, and I still don't know why exactly. But I got in, and I was stunned when Abrams came out.
Suddenly, unexpectedly.
Unexpectedly. The deputy spokesperson came out, and then Abrams came out, and the deputy spokesperson introduced him, and Elliott Abrams.
He's supposed to be the point man
on Venezuela. Elliott Abrams is he's now the special envoy to Venezuela. He was named about 2 weeks ago, unscheduled, at a briefing that was given by Pompeo, the Secretary of State. And the next day, they had the Security Council meeting on Venezuela, and Pompeo sat down, made his remarks, and then Elliott Abrams actually took the chair and sparred with the Venezuelan representative and the Russian representatives and others, and it got remarkably little media coverage that he did this. And his background is utterly notorious. He was convicted of lying to Congress as part of the Iran-Contra affair. In the 1980s, he was a figure in that. And
in the Contra affair, where President Reagan said that he didn't know, but arms were sent to the guerrillas, or today we call it terrorists, that they were trying to overthrow the President Ortega's government.
Correct. They sold missiles to Iran, got the profits from that, and used that to go against what Congress had explicitly prohibited. That the U.S. government not arm the Contras.
Covert operation.
Total covert operation. You know, the government was in effect driven underground at this point.
And Elliott Abrams was there in that operation?
He played a role in that, and also in backing a whole series of other right-wing regimes
in Latin America.
In Latin America, especially Guatemala. Totally backed the most murderous, oppressive figures in Guatemala.
And El Salvador?
And El Salvador.
Death squads?
Death squads throughout Central America during the 1980s. And at the end of that, he seemed disgraced in public life. He was convicted of lying to Congress. And then after George H.W. Bush, the father, lost the election
against Clinton,
against Clinton in '92. On Christmas Eve, he pardoned Elliott Abrams and the other Iran-Contra figures, quite clearly partially in an attempt to insulate himself. What everybody is worried Trump will do now about Russiagate, with all of the hype about that, Bush actually did in 1992, and all of these figures are now rehabilitated. Not only Elliott Abrams, but William Barr, the Attorney General for Bush at the time, who approved the pardons, is now about to become, he's going through the Senate now, Trump's new Attorney General. So the person who oversaw the cover-up pardons, as the prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, a lifelong Republican, but somebody who believed in law, was attempting to close in on the Iran-Contra scandal. He was thwarted by these pardons.
So now we're seeing that point, man.
And these figures are now back centrally Elliott Abrams.
And do you believe that the purpose is to overthrow the government of President Maduro?
It is at minimum to severely threaten the overthrow and violence. It's either to actually do it or to make the Venezuelan people around him lose their nerve.
So actively
and capitulate in some manner.
Actively to destabilize the life, the government of that country.
Absolutely, and a whole series of things. The recent story about aid going into Venezuela, so-called aid, where you had the Red Cross and other agencies saying you're politicizing it.
And they don't want to participate.
And they don't want to participate in it. Elliott Abrams has a history of using aid in Central America as a cover for getting weapons in.
Exactly. What they're saying is, under the excuse of sending humanitarian aid, for example, in one of those countries, inside that aid they were going arms to overthrow the elected governments.
Correct.
That's Elliott Abrams.
Correct. So, so he, you know,
so
he gives.
he's in front of you.
He pops up. He's there, and you know, I was of course startled, and then I thought, you know, I maybe should have seen this coming. And he gives his lengthy framing and disassembling about what his claims are about standing up for human rights and democracy and all of this, fabrications and so on. And Matt Lee of the AP gets the first question, and they had taken away his privilege of the first question the prior news conference. So I think because I think he has a history of asking somewhat tough questions, especially on Latin America, and I think that they were in effect threatening Matt with, if you ask too many tough questions right now, we're going to take away your status here. They're in effect union busters. You know, they want a scab situation where everybody is begging for access and asking increasingly soft questions because that's the only way they'll get their voice heard. So Matt asked his question, which I thought might have had a point to it, but an edge to it, but it was kind of soft. And then Bloomberg, total, you know, asking, you know, what countries do you think Maduro will go to? A total, you know, suck-up question. And I'm like, am I going to sit here like a potted plant through this nonsense with my hand up in the air? They're never going to call on me. And the handler, the deputy spokesperson, is like pointing to who will be allowed to ask questions. And you know,
so you
before
were raising your hand.
I was raising my hand, you know, but you know, I'm 4 rows back. The first 3 rows are reserved for outlets with a hard card that the State Department has approved to be in the first 3 rows. Some of whom are, you know, Lori Milroy, you know, journalists with scandalous backgrounds, but who are friendly to the State Department. In any case,
You're trying to put your.
I'm trying to put my hand up, but they're obviously not going to ask me questions. And this deputy spokesperson is acting like a handler off to the side, off camera, but pointing to who gets to ask Elliott Abrams a question, which is not the usual routine at all. Usually it's the spokesperson comes forward, like when I dealt with Heather Nauert. She went out of her way to avoid getting questions from me, but I would occasionally be able to elbow my way in and start asking a question, you know, like, you know, she would make an announcement at the beginning and then I would have a question about the announcement. Now she has to take my question. I'm asking about an announcement that she made and nobody else is asking about the announcement that she made. So she's got to take my question. None of that, none of those minimal allowances of serious questions were allowed here. They had a handler pointing to who. So I was like, okay, look, if we're going to bring back the bad part of the 1980s, Elliott Abrams, I'm going to be Sam Donaldson, who would, during the
famous and renowned
ABC reporter, who would holler out questions at Ronald Reagan that Ronald Reagan didn't want to take. So I was like, okay. So I just started hollering out questions.
Like, for example?
Like, for example, isn't it really something, Mr. Abrams, for you to be talking about human rights given your background of backing death squads in Latin America? And of course, the handler would immediately cut me off, saying, no, 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 over here. And at the beginning of not all, but most questions, most openings of questions that they had, I would start trying to ask a question.
And you were having, even you recorded the questions to make sure that...
Halfway through, it occurred to me, they're going to lower my audio even though there's a microphone in front of each journalist, they're going to lower my audio in the official video for the State Department. So I pulled out my iPhone and I started recording so that I would capture at least some of my questions.
And you were telling me one, but you were putting another question.
At virtually every opening, when they would finish one question and they were about to call on another reporter for another that they wanted to call on, I would start asking another question. I would ask, in today's British Independent, the UN expert, says that the sanctions are what's responsible for much of the suffering in Venezuela. What do you respond to that? They didn't want to take that question.
What was his reaction when you were throwing your questions?
Sure. They would immediately urge another reporter to start their question to drown me out.
Abrams' reaction, facial?
I think he flinched a little bit once or twice. It's hard to say. And maybe that indicates, my God, even in Elliott Abrams, maybe there's a little sense of shame or something in there. But the handler was pacing around. Again, he's off camera.
So what is saying about the freedom of expression?
Right, and that was one of my questions. When they started doing this, I said, you're talking about freedom and democracy, and you're having in Venezuela, and you're having this freedom and democracy here in this stage-managed news conference where you pick and choose questions. This is freedom and democracy. I hollered that out at the press briefing.
No answer.
No answer. So I did it in a journalistic manner, but in a very aggressive manner. When each question started to be asked, after I had my 10 seconds of attempted questioning, I pulled back, and then I took another bite at the apple at the next opening, and that's the way that it went back and forth.
So how did it ended up? When the briefing was finished, what happened?
Well, just at the end, I asked a last question, and I said, the former Spanish foreign minister attempted to broker a deal. Did the U.S. Sabotage that deal? So to the very end.
We're talking Rodríguez Zapatero.
Yes, I tried to ask a question that they obviously didn't want to take. At the end of that, Abrams walks off. The spokesperson comes up and takes questions on other issues, and I sit there and I tweet out, what happened, making use of my time there. And then the news conference is over, and I walk out, and I was a rush coming in, so I didn't sign in, so I went to sign out in the office that they have there, and one of the State Department officials came up to me and said, really wish you wouldn't holler out questions like that. We don't do that here. And I was like, I've seen reporters more than holler out questions. I've seen other reporters storm the door when they were upset, when they had a personal grievance with Nauert, for example. A CNN reporter was cut off by Nauert and shouted, "How dare you?" and stormed the door. And I brought that up to her, and she was like, she knew that the incident that I referred to, that sometimes things really blow up, and I didn't blow up. I asked aggressive questions during each break between questions. And she pressed me further, and I said, look, if we're going to bring back the bad part of the 1980s, we should bring back the good part of the 1980s. The secretaries there didn't know who Sam Donaldson was, so I tried to explain that to them. Then I headed out. I got decent audio from another reporter to juice it up, and we got a little video of what happened.
Let's go to orders. Sir, no. Order. No.
Mr. Abrams, hello. How are you? So, two questions quickly. Are you saying
And that we're against. Let's go to Fox. Rich,
How long can you say that, when did the administration become aware of Mr. Guaido, and how long has the administration been working with Mr. Guaido?
I can't actually answer that question. I think that the leadership that he is giving to the Venezuelan people is really quite extraordinary.
Haven't the, I'm sorry, is this, you barely have any news conferences and now this.
Leslie, you talked about you're hopeful that the Maduro regime wouldn't block aid coming across the border.
Well, let it in. That's all we're asking. Let it in.
Haven't the sanctions had a crushing effect? The UN Special Rapporteur says the sanctions are crushing the Venezuelan people.
You just mentioned the visa restriction.
We will continue to speak to governments around the world.
So you're claiming the U.S. isn't interfering in any way?
There's no greater priority for him, for the department. I would not like to say much more about it because it's important to us.
Did the U.S. scuttle the compromise brokered by the Spanish?
And you were publishing, in a way, you were spreading your experience.
Yes,
and what was any
exactly.
reaction? Because it went through the social
Yeah, it went out through social media, but virtually no pickup. Other reporters, one other reporter gave me their audio. They would never ask the questions that I'm asking or act as aggressively, but they.
But you made sure that everyone knew that you were going through all that.
Yeah. I mean, I got it out as best I could.
Talking about in his opinion, the total illegality of what's going on here, two things. He says, and I'm quoting, "This is a prime example of manipulation of public opinion, as if the world has not seen enough lies from Colin Powell's in 2003, then we saw the tragedy of Libya in 2011, another oil-producing country," he says. "Now is the turn of Venezuela. The only reason for all this," and he concludes, "is to have a looting campaign to be able to privatize the oil industry in Venezuela and to have the profits flown to the 1%. And he continues, and that's very important to get a sense of the illegality of all this. He says, "The countries that recognize Juan Guaido are violating fundamental principles of international law, customary international law, the United Nations Charter, and other norms such as Resolution 2625, 3314 of the General Assembly." And he concludes and he said, "Here we're dealing with a revolt of international order and a revolt against international law, the principle of non-interference in the international affairs. There is not for the US, Canada, UK, France, Germany to say, we prefer this individual as president rather than Mr. Maduro. And it's up to the Venezuelans to decide and under which role they want to have the law." So clearly we're seeing here that are violating all the international law.
They explicitly say that. I mean, when they say something like all options are on the table, that's a threat of the use of force. That's an outright threat. Violation right there. It's out in the open. It's so brazen. One of the toughest question that Abrams got was from a Chinese reporter, very tepidly asking about, are you interfering? And he said that, no, it's Cuba that's interfering with the internal affairs of Venezuela. And I shouted out at that point, you're claiming that the US isn't interfering in any way? You just said you're interfering. and this is, as the UN expert says, part of a history in terms of Iraq. And I mean, what did they do to Iraq? I mean, everybody, I don't know what the US timeline is on Venezuela, but, you know, they smashed the infrastructure of Iraq. They placed sanctions on Iraq in 1990. They smashed the infrastructure in their attack in 1991, and then they let Iraq rot, suffer under the sanctions for 12 years before they moved in for the kill in 2003.
And most of the people who are exposed to the media, the mass media here, they don't get the other side of the coin in this case, and which is that the U.S., through sanctions, are absolutely strangling the economic system of Venezuela, the financial system. They have money, they sell oil, and they don't get the money back from the U.S. because they absolutely freeze the money. They don't let Venezuela...
And the British hold the gold.
The gold that they deposit, Venezuelan gold deposit in their banks, and they say we don't get it back. The European Union has at least $2 billion frozen. So Venezuela cannot get dollars that they sold things against, and they cannot buy things like food and medicines because the U.S. is impeding that. So they don't let them use their money to feed their own people. The U.S. strangled that, and then looks like perversely they're denouncing that the government of Venezuela is having their people
not providing for their people.
Food. So they create the situation, and then they say that we are the saviors of the situation that perversely they create. Is that what they're doing?
I think that's in broad strokes what they're doing. It's not clear to me if Venezuela could have protected itself better in terms of moving its reserves sooner to places that it could trust. And it's remarkable given that Venezuela was, you know, through Citgo giving discounted oil several years ago to people in the United States.
To heat during the winter.
The winter.
So how do you think that is going to be the end?
It's hard to say. I think that the U.S. is obviously threatening and is obviously going to do things, whether or not they, you know, it's like in Syria. You know, I'm not sure if they think that they're strong enough really to do regime change, or if they just want to sow chaos and suffering in order to marginalize Venezuela on the world stage as much as possible, so it simply is consumed, obviously, with taking care of itself at this point, rather than being a regional power, being able to speak up about things, being able to assert itself on the world stage. So I don't want to say their goal is regime change. They are ecstatic that, you know, a potentially powerhouse country like Venezuela is on the ropes the way that it is. That's a victory right there for the U.S. establishment.
Just final question. So this is the Cold War 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's no pretext for a Cold War. What's the Cold War?
But I mean, against Latin America.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's you know, it's Monroe Doctrine. It's
2.0.
It's you know, another level of neocolonialism. Absolutely.
Sam Husseini, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.